FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with the latest World Cup video. It's going to be the expansion of the tier list into the midfield position. Goalkeepers will be uncovered at a later date because unfortunately the game just simply hasn't added enough keepers for us to really evaluate the prices of keepers, and therefore I'm looking at the midfielders now before we step into the forwards next. What I would like to say is we have some enabler options and we have some premium options all the way up to someone like a KDB, who's the exclusive midfield premium in this area. Of course, he's competing with some of the forward positions when we talk about premiums, and you have to kind of keep that in mind when we talk about the midfielders. One thing as well, when you compare to FPL, is there's no bonus points here. There are no player of the match points. So midfielders are benefiting from tackles made, but not necessarily the additional sort of triple bonus that you usually see, which allows for a midfield in FPL to flourish extremely hard. And I think here the midfielders are somewhat more balanced. We have some absolute steals, and we'll talk about them, of course, these green and yellow options, whereas we have some overpriced midfielders that are not included in this cheat sheet or have categorized as a orange option for now. Starting from the budget options, we have Kazri at 4.5. He will be potentially the penalty taker for Tunisia, but whether Tunisia is actually able to get a penalty versus Denmark and France is debatable, and they only really have one good game on paper, which is going to be versus Australia, which I still think will be a tough match for them. And from that point of view, I would say very hard to actually see whether he actually gets points because you're kind of gambling for a penalty, and that actually doesn't happen too often for weaker teams, so that's one thing to keep in mind. As far as Depal, you're looking at a player here who plays for Argentina, the much more dominant side in this group, and he is someone who has been getting assists quite consistently for this Argentina team, even though he pretty much just plays like a box-to-box midfielder. He's not going to be someone who's playing like a 10, and simply put, you're looking at someone who's just very, very cheap, could get you points for the defensive basis through the tackles, and might even slip an assist here and there. I would say one assist really through this whole group stage run is good enough for a return for Depal, but at 5.0, I don't think you're going to have too many complaints. At 5.5, we actually have some absolute steals here, and this really depends on one thing: Trossard's availability to start and whether he'll play in a left wing back position or even a left wing sort of inside forward position that Hazard usually employs in the Belgium team. If we get some news that Hazard isn't ready to play match day 1, then Trossard is an absolutely great punt versus Canada. We have seen an electric season from him domestically in the Premier League, and I think he will build on that within this Belgian team. I already talked about how in previous times we've seen him score a brace for Belgium coming off the bench, so there's at least that small little ceiling there and that variance where Belgium are actually quite a strong team employing Trossard as a super sub. And even if he gets a start for match day 1 and then becomes a sub, I still think the actual interest from Trossard at a 5.5 price is worth it because Belgium could be quite an explosive team. Araceta is someone who plays for Uruguay and is going to be a cam/right wing player, and he's been integral in their qualification campaign. I wouldn't say he's necessarily been nailed as of late, but I do think he is an underpriced player in this game, probably the best 5.5 by far. Someone that I think is a little bit of an easier punt unless we get that news that Trossard will start. He is someone who has easier fixtures in the sense that he gets to play versus opponents that I would say are more likely to attack. I think Morocco and Croatia can be quite defensive teams at times in comparison to, let's say, a South Korea and a Portugal. And those are kind of my thoughts on Uruguay and Araceta. I think the interesting thing with Uruguay is you have some players like Bentancur and Valverde and even Matias Vecino, and you'll have to be picking between these options, but they're all center mid options that are a little bit more expensive, where you have here a technical, almost winger type player who could play like a 10 for Uruguay, and he's much cheaper. So I'd much rather move into this option if you're employing to go for the Uruguay offense. And it's even very hard to actually pick between the forwards of Uruguay because of how Darwin, Luis Suarez, and Cavani will interact. Cavani is expected to maybe play in match day 3, and you'll have to even maybe think about moving Darwin out sooner than later if he doesn't get to start each game consistently. At 6.0, you have a wide variety of options. You have someone like Kudus who's been exceptional in the Champions League campaign, but obviously playing for a much weaker team in Ghana here, whereas we still have seen actually some fantastic performance despite Ajax being I would say the losing team in most Champions League games, with Kudus actually having an increasing amount of goal involvements, even playing like a striker at times. However, he does play as a midfielder for Ghana, but if he positionally changes somewhere in this tournament, let's say if we see that in the Portuguese game, then potentially we could employ him in the South Korea and Uruguay game, so he's definitely one to think about in the future. Klaassen is someone who had a great World Cup qualifier campaign, but has not really been integral to this Netherlands side that have employed Gakpo more recently as a 10, and he will therefore have to compete in the midfield position with other players, and I don't think he's really going to have a starting spot in this team. However, his ceiling, if he gets to starting position or if he's already showing good performances, could be quite high. One to think about in the future. Kostic and Skov Olsen are the ones that you want to think about. Kostic plays a little bit of a different position compared to how he does domestically. In the Bundesliga, he actually operates almost like a left winger, whereas for Serbia, he's playing exclusively like a left wing back, allowing Tadic to play quite a free role in the attacking system that they have, which is predicated around both, I would say, primarily Mitrovic and Tadic, as you can see in the goal involvements for Serbia. As a result, Kostic's ceiling is much lower. But just looking at his actual creativity across Europe, I would say Kostic is a very interesting option at a 6.0 price. The first match is going to be Brazil, so I'd probably actually avoid him for the first match and then look to employ him in my team as a future transfer in game weeks 2 and 3, or match days 2 and 3, sorry. As far as Skov Olsen, he has been someone who's been a much brighter light for this Denmark team than a Damsgaard. Damsgaard, of course, was exceptional in the Euros. We thought about him as a great punt, and he emerged as a better option, all the way towards getting that goal in England, where I think a lot of people owned him in their teams. However, Skov Olsen is that sort of player where he's already kind of established himself in this Danish team, has a lot of goal involvements in previous matches compared to someone like an Eriksen, who plays a little bit more of a, I would say, commanding, controlling, and technical role for the team, whereas Skov Olsen is allowed to play a little bit more of an attacking role and is expected to, I would say, get quite a lot of the goal creation and the chance creation in the team as well. So he's a great pick at 6.0 because we know the strength of Denmark as a team, and they simply have 2 out of 3 great fixtures at a price of 6.0. This is the first sort of true attacker here where I would say it is quite worthwhile and most likely absolutely nailed. Arrascaeta, of course, can be compared to him as that sort of option there, and I think you could actually employ both if you're looking to go for a little bit more of an attacking option with some of your bench enablers. As far as Bergwijn, I think he is absolutely the steal in the midfield draft and the tier list. He is probably the most cheapest option here because the Netherlands have simply 3 great games. And when you look across the board, and even if you look lower down the cheat sheet, a lot of these players who have great fixtures, such as from England, when you're talking about Saka and Foden, have variable minutes, whereas I'm expecting Bergwijn to play at least 85 minutes a game, and he has been electric in the recent campaign for Netherlands. We've seen Gakpo and Depay share also the offensive burden too, but Bergwijn has been right up there with them. And at the midfield position, because you're probably going to be employing a lot of premium forwards, and because Depay is not ready to play match day 1, I wouldn't really go with the punt towards Gakpo. I much prefer Bergwijn as a pick in the midfield to actually take that second Netherlands spot if you are going for Denzel Dumfries in your team. And I think he's an absolute lock. 7.5, you've got someone like Perisic, who hasn't really lit it up domestically with Spurs. He's been a very creative player, very good with the set pieces in the corners, not necessarily fantastic in open play, but we know that this dramatically changes regardless with the Croatian national team, and that players do play different roles. He, of course, is going to play a little bit more of an advanced role for this team, and we're hoping that he can find his great highs. If you actually look at World Cup history, he's almost had 1 goal involvement per game in his 10 matches in the World Cup in the past, and even when you look at Euro performances, he's had some great ones as well. At 7.5, I think he's an interesting pick because he's nailed. He's one of those options here where if you expect Croatia to do well because they have the easier fixtures in the group first, in Morocco and Canada, then Perisic can be quite an interesting punt. If you're willing to kind of forego I'd say the lack of clinicalness in terms of goal scoring this season and also the lack of chances that he simply had with this Tottenham team, I do think he is used in quite an advanced position for this Croatian team at times, almost playing like a left inside forward and therefore also drifting into a striker position when they move into a 4-4-2 shape. And I think Perisic is going to be interesting. Bellingham is only going to be a second-tier option for me as well, and the reason why is because I do think there might be a slight chance of rotation if Calvin Phillips can find his way back into the team. I would obviously say that Bellingham deserves to start every game just based on form and how much of an improvement this English team has with him in the side, but of course I'm not Gareth Southgate and I don't really get to make those decisions, and probably I shouldn't for fair reasons. Bellingham, however, has been electric in the Champions League from the defensive point of view and also from the attacking point of view. You'll actually see in these kind of bigger games where there is a little bit more space, people are a little bit more timid, that Bellingham is someone who does rise to the occasion, looks for great opportunity to score. As one of the leading box-to-box midfielders in the world, he's almost like Fede Valverde, where he's very informed, looking for goals and assists in almost any game possible, and he's 1 million cheaper. The one thing, of course, I can say is that he's not nailed, and I still think he's a touch overpriced, but for a very strong English team with 3 great fixtures compared to an Uruguay team who still has to face Portugal, that's the kind of toss-up there where Bellingham does appear to be a better option. As far as Tadic, when we move into the 8.0 positions, we've already talked about how he will be an interesting pick. But once again, one to actually think about in match day 2, in my opinion, because when you have that first Brazilian match, I'm not really expecting much from a Tadic, and it's a lot of an investment to go into an 8.0 midfielder who has to face probably the favorites of the tournament. I wouldn't really go towards Tadic immediately. However, I would immediately put him into my mind in match day 2 and match day 3 when I have options to play around with. Eriksen is someone who we've seen has been quite quintessential for this Denmark team. The actual overall level of play, the creativeness, the ability to actually command the ball and control the game is predicated on Eriksen actually being on the field, and we've seen that in recent times. We've even seen that with United at points this season alongside Fernandes. But Eriksen is someone who I don't think has the attacking ceiling that we really look for in an 8.0 player. I think he is a little bit overpriced. The same can be said for Hazard, who of course was a absolute world beater in the previous World Cup, but a lot of time has gone since then. He's a much reduced player when you look at him and his form in Real Madrid. And even for Belgium, I would say looking at the Euros, I don't think he really lived up to any of the highs we saw in the previous World Cup or generally over his career in Chelsea. And I think Hazard is someone that we must look with slightly dimmed expectations. I don't really expect too much from him, and I don't think he's even up to full fitness. So he might not even play the full minutes compared to some other players who'll be playing 90 minutes a game. And I think that's why Hazard has to be a second-tier option, unless we really see some rejuvenated form in the Canada game, and I might be investing in Hazard as well. Musiala is someone who, unfortunately, is just going to be playing a variable position. He could start games, he could also be on the bench, and I think that's simply the landscape of where he's at with this German national team. I think Sane, of course, is a little bit more expensive, and we talked about that. You also have options like Goretzka and Kimmich, who've actually provided a lot of production efficiency from the assist point of view, but the ceiling isn't necessarily high there with Goretzka and Kimmich. You're really looking for them to score a kind of explosive goal out of nowhere, whereas Musiala is someone who's, of course, going to play in a much more technical 10-ish role where he's allowed to thrive, and he will potentially even find a goal coming off as a sub. Whether you want to make that gamble is a different issue, because I do think Sane has the opportunity to play much more attacking positions, fill up the space that will be left in behind by Timo Werner being excluded with his team with his injury, and I therefore think Musiala is someone to wait and think about and see whether he actually grows into this tournament, because of course the second game is already Spain, and that's an incredibly tough game to actually think about. Saka and Foden, I'm going to talk about them together, even though Foden's an 8.5 option. Saka is someone who of course has lit it up domestically and has continued to grow as a player year on year, and we do see him at times start for England, but the same thing can be easily said for someone like Foden, who's an incredibly technical player and probably someone that will actually start ahead of Saka based on recent games and how Southgate has employed Foden. They will be sharing that spot because Sterling will be occupying one of the other positions on the pitch when it comes to the winger role. We've seen, of course, Sterling being able to play left wing, right wing. I think Saka and Foden are equally flexible too. Foden might even be able to play in certain midfield positions, although I don't think so comfortably for this kind of structure that Southgate wants to employ. And therefore, Foden and Saka are a little bit too expensive at this price. When we look at and consider as well how cheap the English defenders are, then you can actually say that Saka and Foden probably aren't worth the gamble, particularly when Kane is someone who's absolutely nailed for 90 minutes and someone you can bank on with the additional help of penalties and shots on targets and getting points through that. Di Maria is someone who I would say is an interesting pick at the 8.5 position. For me, he is someone who only has 55 to 60 minutes per game, and I think he has been rested in recent memory, of course, because he has quite a big burden for this Argentina team. He's still one of the leading creators for this team, and when you even see, for example, in big games such as the Italy game where they had to fight the kind of winner of the Copa America versus the Euro winner, he had an electric game. I think just as great as Messi, who of course has been in the form of his life. Again, something that Messi has done for practically 2 decades now and more. And Di Maria is still one of the leading players for this Argentina team, alongside Lautaro Martinez, who's probably going to share most of the goals. I think Di Maria will play a little bit more of a creative role for this team, as he has with his great vision in many times past. But I think Di Maria is probably not worth the gamble as a top tier option, because he's not going to play the minutes required for us to really benefit from Argentina's great fixtures. I'm expecting 55 to 60 minutes per game, potentially even some matches where he might be rested, and that's going to be an issue for someone like Di Maria and someone who's employing 8.5 million to invest into him. The same can be said for players like Foden. I've already talked about that, but when you talk about Modric and Valverde, these are both players who have been absolutely essential still for Real Madrid. Modric, of course, despite being 37. Valverde, of course, an up-and-coming player that we've seen grow year on year. And this year we've seen some exceptional goals from him, mostly from outside the box. He's shown, of course, his ability to play many positions. Of course, he will be most likely playing in the midfield position for Uruguay, as opposed to that kind of right-wing hybrid position that he plays for Real Madrid. And I really am not expecting too much from him because he's a little bit overpriced. At 8.5, you're trying to bank on a player who will hopefully score a lot of outside-the-box goals and continue his ridiculous form in both the Champions League and domestically in La Liga, but I don't really think that's going to happen. I do think he's a little bit overpriced from that point of view. We've already talked about Arteta and how he's going to be 5.5 million, someone who can play for Uruguay at a much cheaper price, saving you 3 million. I think you just have to kind of take that money saving, that cost saving there. 9.0, we talked about Sane as well when comparing him to Musiala, but I think Sane is super interesting because Germany are very limited in the forward position. I think he will be employed to actually occupy these deep positions. Havertz as well is someone who I would say has been a little bit more interesting from a goals and assists perspective for this German national team compared to how he actually operates within Chelsea. And I still think that this German team is very attacking. I don't think their defense is particularly good. We've actually seen them be run over, and they also provide a lot of chances, and they allow enemy teams to kind of press them, and they play this kind of up and down sort of style of football. And I think Sané is someone who absolutely thrives in that structure. The more chances you give someone like Sané, who isn't particularly clinical, the better, because he is someone who thrives in that sort of structure where he's able to run in between defenders with his great athleticism. And I think Sané is going to be a great pick, even though he does seem a touch overpriced. I just think the ceiling is there. Of course, you still have to factor in that Spain game, but I do expect that to be a little bit easier in terms of both teams scoring that match, as opposed to if you were to employ, let's say, a Spanish or German defender and having to think about match day 2 where you won't likely keep that clean sheet. Fernandes is going to be an option, but I think a second-tier option for Portugal. We just simply have seen that when Ronaldo is playing, and I don't think this is a criticism of Ronaldo, but more so the role that Fernandes plays, it is going to be a little bit more creative, a little bit less offensive, similar to how he's operating within this United team this season, and also in arguably the last 2 years past. He is playing much more of a creative role. He is at times a box-to-box midfielder and a creative 10, someone who's allowed to float in different areas of the pitch, but still occupies a kind of defensive capacity as well in terms of keeping up the press with his stamina. However, I just think at 9.5, it's still a little bit too expensive. You have other options, even within the defensive positions for Portugal, that are interesting. And simply put, the midfielders are a little bit too overpriced for this Portuguese team. And I would much rather back, I would say, their defenders, as I said. And at 11 million, we have the tried and trusted option in De Bruyne, someone who's been absolutely consistent for Belgium in the last 2 to 3 major tournaments that he's participated in, and even on a domestic level has continued with a fantastic form, showing the highest level of chance creation he has within recent years, most likely because he's been playing with Erling Haaland. But that actually does throw the spanner in the works, because you have someone like Lukaku who might not be playing match day 1, and that limits the ceiling of De Bruyne. So I actually think De Bruyne's ability to get great hauls in this World Cup is also tied to whether Lukaku is ready to play. We know Lukaku is not necessarily fit for match day 1, and I therefore think that De Bruyne might be even considered as a second-tier option, a yellow option for now in the World Cup, just because the ceiling isn't there with finding a target man that is as good as Lukaku in the way that this Belgian team wants to play. And of course, he will play very offensive positions. If you actually watch the way he plays for Belgium, De Bruyne almost plays like a false striker, and he's allowed to actually not press, and the team actually sacrifices for him so that they can push the ball up high and employ him in the most crucial spaces, which is in and around the edge of the box, as opposed to at times when he plays for the City team, and you could even see him playing in defensive positions, carrying the ball out from defense. And that's the main difference here with Belgium, why he has a little bit of a higher attacking ceiling from the goal scoring point of view, in my opinion. And as we talked about in international football, there are much more chances for these top level players because the quality of teams aren't as robust as in domestic level, where you have very well-rounded squads. And I think this is interesting for De Bruyne because you have to compare him with players like Mbappe, Kane, Messi, and Neymar, and even Benzema. And it might not be an option you'd like to move into because he's so expensive, and we have so many great options like Schoffholsen, like Bergwijn, like Depal, like Hazri, like Arteta in the midfield position, and maybe you could bolster the forward positions and the defensive positions instead. And that's going to be my thoughts on the midfield. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one, which is going to be the forwards tier list.